The candles had barely been lit when Cassandra Wren stood up from her chair and told the truth in front of 40 people who did not want to hear it. The dining hall of Rothmere Manor had gone silent. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. A servant near the door froze with a tray of wine glasses trembling in her hands. All eyes turned to the young woman standing at the long table, her face pale but steady, her voice still ringing through the room. She had just told Lady Margaret Vale, the most feared woman in 3 counties, that she was a liar. Nobody spoke to Lady Margaret that way. Not the earls who owed her husband money, not the mothers who wanted their daughters seated near her at dinner, not even her own sister. But Cassandra had watched the older woman mock a young housemaid only moments before, calling the girl clumsy and stupid in front of the whole table because she had spilled a few drops of soup, and something inside Cassandra had simply refused to stay quiet any longer. "You embarrassed her on purpose," Cassandra said, her hands pressed flat against the table to stop them from shaking. "She is 16 years old, and she works from before sunrise until after midnight, and you laughed at her because it amused you. That is not wit, my lady. That is cruelty wearing a fine dress." A gasp moved around the table like wind through dry leaves. Lord Rothmere's wife dropped her napkin. Someone near the window let out a nervous laugh that died the instant Lady Margaret turned her head. The older woman's face did not change much. That was the frightening part. She simply set down her wine glass with great care, as though she were setting down a weapon she planned to pick up again later. "You will regret this evening, Miss Wren," she said quietly. "I promise you that." Cassandra did not look away. She had spent 19 years being told to lower her eyes, soften her words, smile when she wanted to speak, and she was tired of it. She held Lady Margaret's stare until the older woman rose from the table herself and walked out of the room without another word, her skirts hissing against the floor like a warning. For a moment nobody moved. Then the dinner continued as though nothing had happened, though the conversation now came in careful, nervous bursts, and more than one guest glanced at Cassandra, as if she had grown a second head. Across the table, a man she had barely noticed before that evening was watching her, with an expression she could not quite read. He was tall, dark-haired, dressed simply, compared to the other men in the room, and he had said almost nothing all night. She would later learn his name was Adrian Vane, the Duke of Ashworth, though at that moment she only registered that he was staring at her the way one might stare at something rare and unexpected, like snow falling in summer. He did not look horrified. He did not look amused, the way some of the younger men did, treating her outburst like entertainment. He looked, if anything, thoughtful, almost impressed. It was such a strange thing to notice in the middle of what was clearly about to become a disaster, that Cassandra pushed the thought away and finished her meal in silence, her appetite gone, her stomach twisted into a hard knot. Her father found her an hour later in the small library off the main hall, where she had retreated to escape the whispers following her through every room like smoke. Lord Henry Wren was not a cruel man, but he was a frightened one, and fear could make a person say cruel things without meaning to. He shut the door behind him and stood with his back against it, his face gray in the candlelight. "Do you understand what you have done?" he asked. "I told the truth. You humiliated the wife of the man who holds the note on this house, Cassandra. Do you understand what that means? Rothmere owes Lord Vale a great deal of money, and Lady Margaret has more influence over this family's future than either of us would like to admit. One word from her and every door in London closes to us, every invitation withdrawn, every match for you and your sister ruined before it begins. So I should have let her humiliate a child instead, because the child has no money and no title to protect her." Her father rubbed his eyes, and for a moment he looked older than his 50 years. "I am not saying you were wrong. I am saying you were reckless. There is a difference between having a conscience and announcing it to a room full of people who can destroy us." Cassandra said nothing. There was nothing to say that would make him understand. She had grown up watching her father bend and fold himself smaller and smaller in front of people with more money and more power, apologizing for opinions he never had the courage to voice, and she had promised herself years ago that she would not become the same kind of person. It seemed her promise had finally cost something. "I have to think," her father said, more to himself than to her. "I have to think about how to fix this." He left the room without saying goodnight, and Cassandra sat alone among the shelves of books that had never once judged her for speaking her mind, and allowed herself, finally, to cry. She did not hear the door open again until a voice spoke from just inside it, low and careful, as if the speaker were approaching a wounded animal. "I did not mean to disturb you." She looked up, startled, and found the Duke of Ashworth standing a respectful distance away, his hands clasped behind his back, his dark eyes steady on her face. "Your Grace?" She stood quickly, wiping at her cheeks, mortified to be seen this way by anyone, let alone a duke. "Forgive me, I did not hear you knock." "I did not knock. I should have. I apologize." He paused, glancing at the door as though considering whether to leave. Then he did not leave. "I wanted to say something to you, and I was afraid if I waited until morning I would talk myself out of it." Cassandra straightened her shoulders, bracing herself. She expected a lecture. She expected another voice telling her how foolish she had been, how much damage she had caused, how a young woman of good family ought to behave in company. Instead, he said, "What you did tonight took a great deal of courage." She blinked. "I beg your pardon? Lady Margaret has humiliated servants and guests alike for as long as I have known her, and no one has ever said a word against her, because everyone in that room depends on her goodwill in one way or another. You do not. You had nothing to gain and a great deal to lose, and you spoke anyway. I have sat through 100 dinners in that woman's company, and said nothing. Because it was easier, because it was safer. Tonight you reminded me how much I have hated my own silence." Cassandra did not know how to answer. She had braced herself for judgment and found something else entirely waiting for her instead, and it left her unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the evening's scandal. "My father believes I have ruined this family," she said finally. "Your father is frightened, and frightened men often mistake honesty for danger." Adrian's voice was gentle but certain. "I do not believe you have ruined anything, Miss Wren. I believe you have shown this house exactly who you are, and I do not think that is a small thing." "It may not matter what either of us believes," she said quietly. "Lady Margaret does not forget an insult, and she does not forgive one either." "No," he agreed. "She does not." They stood there a moment longer, the candlelight flickering between them, and Cassandra found herself studying his face, the way she might study a puzzle she had not expected to find interesting. There was something careful about him, something guarded, as though he had learned long ago to keep his thoughts locked away where no one could use them against him. And yet he had come to this room, alone, at some risk to his own reputation, simply to tell a disgraced young woman that she had done nothing wrong. "Thank you," she said at last, "for saying so." He inclined his head, and for the briefest moment something like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Good night, Miss Wren. I hope tomorrow is kinder to you than tonight has been." It was not. By morning, the story of Cassandra's outburst had traveled through Rothmere Manor and out into the surrounding countryside like fire through dry grass, growing wilder and crueler with every telling. By the time it reached London 2 days later, carried on the tongues of guests eager to share the scandal, Cassandra Wren was no longer simply a young woman who had spoken out of turn. She was, according to the story now circulating through every drawing room in the city, a shameless girl who had screamed at Lady Margaret Vale in front of a room full of witnesses, who had thrown a wine-glass, who had called the Countess names too vulgar to repeat in polite company. None of it was true. It did not matter. The truth rarely survived long once it left a room full of frightened people looking for someone else to blame. Lord Wren received 3 letters within the week withdrawing invitations his family had long depended upon. A 4th arrived from Lady Margaret herself, brief and cold, informing him that she expected never to see his daughter in society again, and that she trusted he understood the wisdom of ensuring that outcome. He did not tell Cassandra about the letters at first. She found out from her sister, who found out from a maid, who had overheard their father discussing the matter with his solicitor in low, urgent tones behind a closed door. By the time Cassandra confronted him directly, his decision had already been made. "You are going to your Aunt Beatrice's estate in the north," he told her, unable to meet her eyes, "until this settles, until people forget." "And if they do not forget?" Her father did not answer. He did not need to. Cassandra understood, in that moment, exactly how far she had fallen, and exactly how alone she now stood in the wreckage of a single honest sentence, spoken in defense of a girl she had never even properly met. She thought, briefly and against her own better judgment, of the Duke of Ashworth's steady voice in the dark library, telling her she had done nothing wrong. She wondered if he would remember saying it once the scandal reached his own ears in its cruelest, most twisted form. She wondered if anyone's kindness could survive what was coming for her now. She would have her answer soon enough. The carriage left before sunrise, so that as few neighbors as possible would see Cassandra Wren leave her home in disgrace. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her forehead against the cold glass of the window, watching the fields blur past in the gray morning light, and told herself she would not cry again. She had done enough of that already. Tears would not undo the letters, would not soften Lady Margaret's fury, would not make her father look at her without that flicker of disappointment he tried so hard to hide, and failed at every time. Her younger sister, Louisa, had wept at the front steps that morning, clinging to Cassandra's arm as though she might be able to hold her in place through sheer will alone. Their father had said little. He had pressed a small purse of coins into her hand, told her to write when she arrived safely, and turned away before she could see whatever was on his face. It might have been sorrow. It might have been relief that the daughter causing him so much trouble would soon be far from London's gossiping tongues. Cassandra chose not to guess which. The journey north took the better part of 4 days, broken by uncomfortable nights at coaching inns where Cassandra kept to herself, unwilling to risk conversation with strangers who might recognize her name and repeat some version of the scandal back to her, each one worse than the last. By the second day, she had stopped correcting people who assumed she was simply a quiet young woman traveling to visit family. It was easier than explaining the truth. It was easier, in a strange way, than remembering it herself. She thought often, in those long hours on the road, of the library at Rothmere Manor, and of a low, steady voice telling her that what she had done took courage. She turned the memory over in her mind more times than she cared to admit, examining it the way one might examine a coin found on the street, uncertain whether it was real or whether she had simply wanted it badly enough to imagine it. The Duke of Ashworth had said kind words to her in private, but kindness spoken in a dim room after midnight rarely survived contact with daylight and public opinion. She had seen it happen before, watched friendships and flirtations dissolve the moment they became inconvenient. She expected nothing different from a duke she had known for the length of a single evening. Aunt Beatrice's estate sat at the edge of a quiet village called Thornfield Hollow, a modest stone house surrounded by hills and sheep pasture, as far from London's ballrooms as Cassandra could imagine. Her aunt, a widow with silver hair and sharp eyes, met her at the door with none of the pity Cassandra had braced herself for. "So," Aunt Beatrice said, looking her up and down, "you told a countess the truth and now you are being punished for it. Come inside before you catch your death standing in that doorway." The house was smaller than what Cassandra had grown up in, but warmer somehow, filled with the smell of baking bread and old books and a fire that never quite went out in the front parlor. Her aunt asked no questions about the scandal that first evening, simply fed her a proper meal and sent her to bed early, and Cassandra slept more soundly than she had in over a week. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Cassandra helped with small tasks around the house, walked the hills surrounding the village when the weather allowed, and slowly, cautiously, began to feel something like peace return to her chest. There was no one in Thornfield Hollow to whisper about her, no drawing rooms to avoid, no letters arriving with cold formal language reminding her exactly how far she had fallen. For the first time since that dinner at Rothmere Manor, she could simply exist without bracing herself for judgment. It did not last. 3 weeks into her stay, a letter arrived from her father that Cassandra read 3 times before she fully understood its contents. Lady Margaret, it seemed, was not satisfied with Cassandra's banishment alone. She had begun speaking of the incident at every social gathering she attended, each retelling more damaging than the last, until the story bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened that evening. Cassandra was now, according to London's most fashionable drawing rooms, a girl of violent temper and no breeding, unfit for any respectable match, a cautionary tale mothers used to warn their daughters against speaking out of turn. Worse still, her father wrote, several families who had previously shown interest in Louisa as a potential match for their sons had quietly withdrawn their attentions, unwilling to risk association with a family now tainted by scandal. Louisa's own prospects, once so promising, were beginning to suffer for a sin she had not committed. Cassandra set the letter down with shaking hands and walked out into the garden, where the cold autumn air did nothing to cool the anger and guilt burning through her chest. She had known her outburst would cost her something. She had not fully understood, until this moment, that it might cost her sister as well. "You are thinking too loudly," Aunt Beatrice said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of tea and settling onto the garden bench without waiting for an invitation. "I can hear it from the kitchen window." Cassandra told her everything then, the letter, Louisa's ruined prospects, the guilt sitting like a stone in her stomach. Her aunt listened without interrupting, and when Cassandra finished, she was quiet for a long moment, watching the wind move through the bare autumn trees. "Do you know what I remember about your mother?" Aunt Beatrice said finally. "God rest her. She once told a bishop in front of half the county that his sermon on the proper behavior of women was the most foolish thing she had ever heard preached from a pulpit. He never forgave her. Half the parish never forgave her. She lived the rest of her days perfectly happy, married to a man who loved her precisely because she refused to shrink herself for anyone's comfort. That is not quite the same as ruining my sister's future." "No," her aunt agreed. "It is not, But I will tell you this, Cassandra. The world will always find a reason to punish a woman for speaking plainly, whether she does it about a foolish sermon or a cruel insult to a servant girl. If you spend your life shaping your words to avoid every possible consequence, you will end up saying nothing at all, and you will hate yourself for the silence far more than you will ever hate the consequences of speaking. Cassandra wanted to believe her. Some days she nearly did. But the guilt over Louisa did not fade so easily, and she wrote back to her father that same evening, offering to do whatever might help repair the damage, though she suspected, and rightly, that there was little to be done from so far away. In the weeks that followed, Cassandra threw herself into small, useful work, as though busy hands might quiet a restless mind. She helped Aunt Beatrice organize the household accounts, taught 2 of the village children their letters twice a week in exchange for baskets of eggs and vegetables, and spent long afternoons in her aunt's garden pulling weeds until her fingernails were permanently stained with soil. It was humble work no one in London would have considered fitting for a viscount's daughter, and Cassandra found she did not mind at all. There was a kind of honesty in it that the ballrooms and dinner parties of her old life had never possessed. Letters from Louisa arrived faithfully every week, and though her sister never once complained, Cassandra could read the strain between the careful, cheerful lines. A young gentleman named Edmund Sorel, the second son of a well-regarded family, had shown particular interest in Louisa before the scandal broke, and his attentions had cooled noticeably in the weeks since, though he had not withdrawn entirely. Louisa insisted she did not mind, that Edmund's good opinion mattered little to her, but Cassandra knew her sister well enough to hear the disappointment she was trying so hard to hide. She wrote back with encouragement she did not entirely feel herself, and spent long nights afterwards staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, wondering whether her single moment of honesty at that dinner table had been worth the price her family was still paying for it. Aunt Beatrice's words about her mother offered comfort in daylight hours, but comfort had a way of thinning out in the darkness, leaving only guilt behind. The village of Thornfield Hollow, for its part, seemed entirely unaware of the scandal attached to her name, and Cassandra found unexpected relief in that ignorance. The baker's wife greeted her warmly each morning. The children she taught called her Miss Cassandra, and fought over who would sit closest to her during their lessons. The vicar's elderly mother invited her to tea twice, and spoke of nothing more scandalous than the price of wool. For the first time in months, Cassandra began to remember what it felt like to simply be a person, rather than a cautionary tale whispered behind gloved hands. It could not last forever, of course. Word eventually reached even Thornfield Hollow, carried by a traveling cousin of the baker who had recently visited London and returned with fresh gossip to share over the counter. Cassandra noticed the shift almost immediately, the way certain villagers grew slightly more formal in their greetings, the way one mother quietly moved her daughter to sit farther from Cassandra during the next lesson. Nothing was said outright, nothing needed to be. Cassandra had learned to read the small, careful distances people placed between themselves and scandal long before anyone spoke a word about it. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she had grown used to disapproval, that a few cooler greetings in a quiet village could hardly wound her after London's cruelty. She was not entirely successful in convincing herself, and she took to walking farther and farther from the house each afternoon, seeking the hills and empty fields where no one's opinion of her could follow. It was nearly a month later, on an evening when an early winter storm rolled down from the hills without warning, that Cassandra's quiet exile collided unexpectedly with the life she had left behind. She had gone walking farther than usual that afternoon, drawn by a break in the clouds that promised a clear evening, and had misjudged both the distance and the speed of the storm building behind the hills. By the time the first heavy drops began to fall, she was miles from her aunt's house, on a narrow road she did not recognize, with the light already fading fast around her. The rain came harder within minutes, cold and relentless, soaking through her cloak until she was shivering, and she quickened her pace toward the only shelter in sight, a large stone house set back from the road behind iron gates, its windows glowing warm against the darkening sky. She had no idea whose house it was. She only knew she could not spend the night exposed to a storm that showed no sign of easing. A servant answered the door before she had even finished knocking, clearly startled to find a soaked and shivering young woman standing on the step in the middle of a downpour. She was ushered inside quickly, water pooling around her boots on the polished floor, and led toward a fire in a nearby sitting room, while the housekeeper fussed over blankets and dry clothes and hot tea. It was only when a familiar voice spoke from the doorway, low and unmistakable, that Cassandra's heart stopped entirely. "Miss Wren." She turned, still wrapped in a borrowed blanket, her hair dripping onto the carpet, and found herself face to face with Adrian Vane, Duke of Ashworth, standing in the doorway of his own home, with an expression somewhere between astonishment and something warmer that he did not quite manage to hide. "Your Grace," she said, mortified beyond words. "I did not know this was your house. I would never have imposed." "You are not imposing," he said quickly. "You are soaked to the bone and standing in my sitting room in the middle of a storm. Please, sit before you catch a fever." She sat, more out of shock than obedience, and watched him cross the room to add another log to the fire himself, waving away the servant who moved to do it for him. It was such a small, ordinary gesture, and yet it struck her as strange coming from a duke, this willingness to do a simple task with his own hands rather than command someone else to do it. "I am staying at my aunt's estate, not far from here," she explained, once she had recovered enough composure to speak steadily. "I did not realize your land bordered hers. I was walking and the storm caught me farther from home than I meant to go." "Thornfield Hollow," he said. "Yes, I know it well. I did not realize you had gone there. My father thought it best, after Rothmere Manor." Something shifted in his expression at the mention of that night, a flicker of something that might have been anger, though it was gone too quickly for her to be certain. "I heard what Lady Margaret has been saying about you in London. None of it resembled what actually happened in that dining room." "You heard the stories?" "Everyone has heard the stories, Miss Wren. That is rather the trouble with stories. They travel a great deal faster than the truth, and they arrive wearing far more interesting clothes." He settled into the chair across from her, close enough to the fire that the light played across the sharp lines of his face. "I have wanted to write to you since that evening. I did not know if it would be welcome." Cassandra did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing at all, and the silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the rain still beating hard against the windows outside. Outside, the storm showed no sign of passing before morning. The storm did not break until well past midnight, and by then Cassandra had accepted that she would not be returning to Thornfield Hollow that night. Adrian had sent a rider through the worst of the rain to inform Aunt Beatrice that her niece was safe and sheltered at Ashworth House, sparing her aunt a night of worry, though it did nothing to settle the awkwardness of Cassandra's situation. She was a young unmarried woman, alone in a duke's house overnight, with only a small number of servants as witnesses to the impropriety of it. In London, such a thing would have been enough to end a reputation entirely. Here, in a house tucked far from society's watchful eyes, it felt almost possible to forget how the world would judge it. Almost. "You need not look so troubled," Adrian said, watching her from across the sitting room as a servant cleared away the remains of a late supper neither of them had eaten much of. "My housekeeper is a woman of excellent discretion, and I intend to have you delivered safely home the moment the roads are passable. No one need ever know the particulars of tonight beyond the fact that a storm forced a traveler to seek shelter." "You forget I already have a reputation for particulars becoming public knowledge, Your Grace." He almost smiled at that, the corner of his mouth lifting in a way that softened the careful reserve he seemed to wear like armor. "Then we shall simply have to trust that lightning does not strike twice." Despite herself, Cassandra felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. There was something in his manner that put her strangely at ease, a quiet steadiness that felt entirely unlike the careless charm of the young men she had met in London ballrooms, all polished manners and empty compliments. Adrian Vane spoke as though he considered every word before he offered it, and somehow that made the words that did escape him feel more valuable for their scarcity. They talked for hours that night, longer than propriety likely allowed, seated on opposite sides of the fire, while rain lashed the windows and thunder rolled distantly over the hills. Cassandra learned that his wife Eleanor had died nearly 4 years earlier, taken suddenly by a fever that no physician had been able to explain or prevent, and that he had spent the years since largely avoiding society, burying himself instead in the management of his estate and the raising of his young ward, a girl named Lucy Fairfax, the orphaned daughter of a close friend who had died in service abroad. "London has never quite forgiven me for refusing to remarry," he admitted, staring into the fire rather than at her. "There is a certain expectation that a duke without an heir should be actively hunting for a wife, and my reluctance to participate in that particular sport has made me something of a curiosity. Mothers still send their daughters to smile at me across ballrooms, hoping persistence might succeed where charm has failed. And has it? No." He glanced at her then, something unreadable in his dark eyes. "I have found very little in London society worth the trouble of pursuing. Most conversations there feel entirely rehearsed, as though everyone is reciting lines from a play they memorized long ago and grew tired of performing. And this conversation, does it feel rehearsed?" "No," he said simply. "This is the first honest conversation I have had in longer than I care to admit." Cassandra felt warmth rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire beside her, and she looked away first. unsettled by how easily he seemed to see through the careful distance she had been trying to maintain. She had spent months telling herself that the kindness he showed her at Rothmere Manor had been a passing courtesy, nothing more. A duke's polite reassurance to a young woman in distress that meant little once the moment passed. Sitting across from him now, watching firelight play across his face as he spoke with unguarded honesty about grief and loneliness and the exhausting performance of society, she found that explanation increasingly difficult to believe. "Tell me about Lucy," she said, eager to shift the conversation somewhere steadier. "Your ward." His whole expression changed at the mention of the girl, warming in a way that transformed his usually careful features into something almost boyish. "She is 11, sharp as a blade, and entirely convinced she knows better than every tutor I have hired for her. Her father was the finest friend I ever had, and when he died, I made him a promise that I would see her raised properly, though I confess I had very little idea what that meant when I made it. I am still learning, most days. She is fortunate to have you." "I am fortunate to have her," he corrected gently. "This house was unbearably quiet before she arrived. She fills it with more noise and chaos than I ever imagined a single child capable of producing, and I would not trade a moment of it." They spoke of easier things after that, books they had both read, the difference between London's manufactured entertainments and the quieter pleasures of country life, and Cassandra found herself laughing more freely than she had in months, the weight of scandal and exile loosening its grip on her chest for the first time since that terrible dinner at Rothmere Manor. It was well past 2 in the morning before either of them noticed how late it had grown, and Adrian rose reluctantly, insisting she retire to the room his housekeeper had prepared, before exhaustion caught up with either of them. "Thank you," Cassandra said at the doorway, uncertain how to properly express what the evening had meant to her. "For the shelter, and for the conversation. I did not realize how much I needed both." "Thank you for the conversation," he replied. "I have had very few of them worth remembering." She did not sleep well that night, her mind turning over every word he had spoken, every careful glance across the firelight, and when morning came bright and clear after the storm's passing, she found herself reluctant to leave despite knowing she must. Adrian insisted on escorting her back to Thornfield Hollow himself, rather than sending her with a servant, and the ride passed in comfortable conversation that made the short distance feel far too brief. Aunt Beatrice met them at the door with sharp, knowing eyes that missed nothing, though she said little beyond thanking the Duke for his hospitality and ushering Cassandra inside with unusual gentleness. "Well," her aunt said once the Duke's carriage had disappeared down the lane, "that was an interesting turn of events." "It was only a storm, Aunt Beatrice." Her aunt did not look convinced, and Cassandra found she could not entirely blame her. In the days that followed, the Duke of Ashworth found increasingly frequent reasons to call at Thornfield Hollow. He arrived once with a book he thought Cassandra might enjoy, claiming he had simply been in the neighborhood and remembered their conversation about it. He arrived again a week later with Lucy in tow, insisting the girl had been eager to meet the woman who had apparently defended a servant girl against the fearsome Lady Margaret Vale, a story that had clearly reached even an 11-year-old's ears in some form. Lucy proved to be exactly as sharp and unruly as Adrian had promised, peppering Cassandra with questions about the scandal that made both Aunt Beatrice and Adrian wince, though Cassandra found herself answering honestly, unable to summon the same guarded caution around the girl's open curiosity that she maintained with adults. "I think you are right to say it," Lucy declared with the fierce certainty only a child could manage. "My governess says a lady should always be polite, but I think being polite to someone cruel just helps the cruel person keep being cruel." "Lucy," Adrian said, though there was no real reprimand in his voice, only quiet amusement. "It's true," the girl insisted, unbothered, and Cassandra found herself laughing despite everything, warmed by the fierce, uncomplicated loyalty in the child's eyes. Over the following weeks, something steady and quiet began building between Cassandra and Adrian, built not on grand romantic gestures but on small shared moments, walks through the hills with Lucy running ahead chasing birds, long conversations over tea about books and grief, and the particular loneliness of being expected to perform a role that never quite fit. Cassandra found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness she tried and largely failed to disguise, and more than once she caught Aunt Beatrice watching them together with a small, satisfied smile that she wisely chose not to comment on aloud. But Cassandra remained cautious, guarding some careful distance around her heart even as it grew increasingly difficult to maintain. She had been burned before, not by romance but by trust, by believing her honesty would be valued rather than punished, and the wound from that lesson had not fully healed. A duke's attention, however genuine it seemed in the quiet of a country afternoon, could vanish the moment London's harsher judgments reasserted themselves. She had seen how quickly favor could turn to scorn. She was not certain she could survive watching it happen with someone she had allowed herself to care for. Adrian, for his part, seemed to sense her hesitation, and never pressed for more than she was willing to give. He simply kept arriving, kept finding reasons to stay a little longer each visit, kept looking at her with that same steady, patient warmth that had first caught her attention in a dim library, the night her whole world had begun to fall apart. There was one afternoon in particular that Cassandra would return to often in her memory in the weeks that followed, turning it over the way one turns over a smooth stone found on a riverbank, examining every angle until it becomes familiar and precious. Adrian had arrived without Lucy that day, explaining that the girl was occupied with her lessons, and there was something different in his manner from the moment he stepped through Aunt Beatrice's door, a quiet purpose beneath his usual composure that Cassandra could not quite place. Her aunt, with unusual tact, announced she had letters to write, and left the two of them alone in the small parlor, though Cassandra suspected the letters were largely an excuse. "I have been thinking about something you said," Adrian began, seated across from her with his hands loosely clasped. "The night of the storm. You told me that Lady Margaret does not forget an insult, and does not forgive one either. I have been wondering whether that applies equally to gratitude. I am not certain I understand your meaning." "I mean," he said carefully, "that I find myself increasingly reluctant to imagine my days without your company in them, and I do not know how to say that without it sounding like exactly the kind of rehearsed line I told you I despise in London ballrooms." Cassandra's breath caught somewhere in her chest, and for a long moment she could not find any words at all. She had suspected, of course, had felt the shift in the air between them growing warmer with every visit, but hearing it spoken aloud, plainly and without the careful hedging he usually favored, struck her with unexpected force. "Your Grace." "Adrian," he corrected gently, "please. I think we are long past the point where titles serve either of us well." "Adrian," she repeated, testing the shape of his name aloud for the first time, and found she liked the sound of it far too much. "I do not know what to say to that." "You need not say anything tonight. I only wanted you to know it plainly, rather than leaving you to guess at intentions I have not been brave enough to voice." He held her gaze steadily, though she could see the effort it cost him, the careful control of a man unused to exposing his own uncertainty. "I have spent 4 years telling myself I was content with solitude, that Lucy and my estate were enough to fill whatever I had lost when Eleanor died. I believed it, mostly, until a young woman stood up in the middle of a crowded dinner and told a countess the truth no one else had the courage to speak. I have not stopped thinking of that moment since. That moment nearly destroyed my family," Cassandra said quietly, though there was less bitterness in the words now than there had once been. "It is strange to hear it described as anything other than a disaster. It was courage, Cassandra. I have watched a great many people in my life choose comfortable silence over difficult honesty, myself included more often than I would like to admit. You chose differently, at real cost to yourself, because you believed it was right. I do not think that is a small thing, and I do not think it should be treated as one, regardless of what London's drawing rooms have decided to call it instead." She did not know how to respond to such plain sincerity, unused as she was to receiving it, and so she simply allowed herself, for the first time since that terrible night at Rothmere Manor, to hope that something good might yet grow from the wreckage of that single honest sentence. It was a fragile hope, easily bruised, but it settled into her chest that afternoon and refused entirely to leave. They did not speak of it again directly in the days that followed, both of them seeming to understand instinctively that whatever had begun that afternoon needed time and patience to grow properly, rather than being rushed toward some grand declaration neither of them was yet prepared to make binding. But something had shifted between them nonetheless, a quiet understanding that colored every subsequent visit, every shared glance across Aunt Beatrice's parlor, every moment Lucy caught them smiling at each other and rolled her eyes with the particular exasperation only an 11-year-old could summon toward adults being deliberately slow about matters of the heart. Word of Adrian's frequent visits to Thornfield Hollow did not stay contained to the quiet village for long. Aunt Beatrice's own correspondence with distant relations carried news of the Duke's attentions southward eventually, as such things always traveled no matter how carefully guarded, and Cassandra received a letter from her father within a month, expressing cautious, almost disbelieving hope that her circumstances might yet improve beyond anything he had dared imagine when he sent her away in disgrace. Even Louisa's letters grew brighter, carrying news that Edmund Sorel had renewed his attentions with fresh enthusiasm the moment rumors reached London that the reclusive Duke of Ashworth had taken a sudden interest in the disgraced Miss Wren. It struck Cassandra as bitterly ironic that her sister's prospects might improve because of a man's regard for her, rather than despite the scandal that had nearly ruined them both. But she chose not to dwell too long on the unfairness of a world where a woman's worth so often depended on whose attention she managed to attract. It was Aunt Beatrice, unsurprisingly, who finally said aloud what neither of them had dared to voice. "That man is in love with you," she said one evening, watching Adrian's carriage disappear down the lane after another lengthy visit. "Any fool can see it plainly enough. The only question is whether you intend to let yourself believe it before some fresh disaster arrives to complicate matters." Cassandra did not answer, though her aunt's words settled deep in her chest and refused to leave, a small, stubborn hope she was not yet ready to fully trust, but no longer entirely able to deny either. What neither of them knew, as they stood together in the quiet warmth of that evening, was that word of Adrian's attentions had already traveled far beyond the gentle gossip of distant relations and hopeful sisters. In London, Lady Margaret Vale had heard the rumors from more than one eager source, and had found in them something far more useful than mere idle scandal. A duke's reputation was a valuable thing, and the possibility of attaching it to a young woman she had already worked so hard to ruin struck her not as an inconvenience to be endured, but as an opportunity to be seized and turned to fresh purpose. She was not alone in her interest. Edmund Sorel, whose renewed attentions toward Louisa had seemed at first like a simple return of affection, harbored ambitions of his own that reached considerably higher than a viscount's younger daughter, ambitions that would soon draw him into an alliance with Lady Margaret neither Cassandra nor Adrian could yet imagine. She should have known better than to hope so openly. Trouble, it seemed, had a way of finding her precisely when life finally began to feel steady again. Lady Margaret Vale had not survived 30 years at the center of London society by allowing insults to go unanswered, and the news that the reclusive Duke of Ashworth had developed a tender regard for Cassandra Wren struck her as both an outrage and an opportunity in equal measure. She received Edmund Sorel in her private sitting room on a gray afternoon, offering him tea he barely touched, and studied the young man across from her with the calculating patience of someone who had learned long ago how to turn other people's ambitions into weapons for her own purposes. "You want the Sorel name attached to real influence," she said, without preamble. "Marrying a viscount's second daughter will not achieve that, however charming the girl might be. But Ashworth's ward, Lucy Fairfax, stands to inherit a considerable fortune from her late father's estate when she comes of age, and a man positioned as her guardian's trusted friend could find himself remarkably well placed to guide that inheritance in useful directions." Edmund set down his cup carefully. "The Duke shows no sign of relinquishing his guardianship, my lady. Not willingly, no. But reputations can be managed, Mr. Sorel, with the right pressure applied in the right places. If it became known that Ashworth's judgment could not be trusted, that he had entangled himself with a woman of proven scandal and reckless temper, certain relations of the late Lord Fairfax might begin to question whether the girl's guardianship ought to remain in his hands at all. I have connections among the Fairfax family who would listen most attentively to such concerns, properly presented. And Miss Wren's sister? You would have me abandon my pursuit of Louisa entirely?" Lady Margaret's smile was thin and cold. "I would have you pursue her precisely as ardently as before, until it suits us to reveal that your true interest lay elsewhere. A broken engagement, timed correctly, causes a most useful kind of scandal, Mr. Sorel, and I suspect you will find the Fairfax fortune considerably more rewarding than anything the Wren family could offer you." Edmund said nothing for a long moment, turning the proposal over with the careful calculation of a man weighing ambition against conscience and finding ambition, as he so often did, the heavier weight. "What precisely would you require of me?" "Patience for the moment, and a willingness to gather whatever information proves useful about the Duke's growing attachment to Miss Wren. The more scandalous the details, the more persuasive our case to the Fairfax relations will become." He agreed, as she had known he would, and Lady Margaret allowed herself a small, satisfied smile once he had departed, already composing in her mind the careful letters she would begin sending to distant Fairfax cousins who had shown little interest in Lucy's welfare, until the possibility of controlling her inheritance was placed delicately before them. Cassandra remained entirely unaware of the scheme taking shape in London as autumn deepened into winter at Thornfield Hollow, and the weeks that followed brought her more happiness than she had known in years. Adrian's visits grew more frequent still, and though neither of them had spoken again as directly as that afternoon in Aunt Beatrice's parlor, the understanding between them deepened with every shared conversation. Every quiet walk through frost-covered hills, every evening spent by the fire while Lucy read aloud from whatever adventure novel currently held her fierce 11-year-old attention. It was Lucy, in fact, who first noticed something troubling. There was a strange man asking questions in the village, she announced one afternoon, marching into Aunt Beatrice's parlor with the particular seriousness she reserved for matters she considered important. He asked the baker how often you visit us, Miss Cassandra, and whether you and Uncle Adrian go walking together unaccompanied. The baker's wife told him it was none of his business, which I thought was exactly right, but he did not seem to like the answer very much. Adrian's expression darkened immediately. Did you see this man, Lucy? Can you describe him? Tall, with a yellow waistcoat and very shiny boots. He did not look like he belonged in the village at all. Cassandra felt a familiar cold unease settle in her stomach, the same feeling she had known too well during her final weeks in London, the sense of being watched and discussed by people who wished her harm. It could simply be idle curiosity, a stranger passing through. Strangers passing through do not typically ask specific questions about a duke's private conduct, Adrian said grimly. Someone sent that man, Cassandra, and I do not think it requires much imagination to guess who might benefit from gathering such information. The confirmation arrived within the week, in the form of a letter from Adrian's London solicitor informing him, with careful and formal language that did little to soften the blow, that certain relations of the late Lord Fairfax had begun making inquiries about Lucy's guardianship, citing concerns about the Duke's judgment and suitability as her caretaker. The letter did not name Lady Margaret directly, but it required little deduction to trace the scheme back to its source, particularly once Adrian's solicitor mentioned, almost in passing, that a Mr. Edmund Sorrel had been seen dining with several of the Fairfax cousins in recent weeks. Adrian arrived at Thornfield Hollow that same evening, his usual careful composure entirely abandoned, pacing Aunt Beatrice's small parlor like a man barely containing his fury. They mean to use Lucy against me, he said, his voice tight with a controlled anger Cassandra had not seen from him before. They mean to twist my regard for you into evidence of poor judgment, and use that evidence to strip me of the one promise I made to my dearest friend before he died. I will not allow it, Cassandra. I will fight this with every resource I possess. And if fighting it costs Lucy her stability regardless of the outcome, prolonged disputes over guardianship can drag through courts for years, Adrian, and every day of it will be spent with lawyers and relations arguing over a child who deserves better than to become a prize in someone else's scheme. Cassandra had seen enough of scandal's slow poison to understand its patterns now, the way it seeped into every corner of a life it touched, damaging even those who had done nothing to invite it. Perhaps the simplest solution is the one they least expect. Perhaps I should remove myself from the situation entirely. Absolutely not. His voice was sharper than she had ever heard it, and for a moment, the careful reserve he usually wore fell away entirely, revealing something raw and urgent beneath. I will not let Lady Margaret's cruelty cost me a second time what her vindictiveness already cost you once. There must be another way. Is there? Cassandra asked quietly. I have watched what these people are capable of, Adrian. I lived through it myself. They do not stop until they have taken everything they set out to take, and they do not care what innocent people are caught in the wreckage along the way. Lucy is 11 years old. She has already lost her father. I will not be the reason she loses her home as well. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the distant echo of Lucy's laughter somewhere upstairs, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around her future. Adrian crossed the room and knelt before Cassandra's chair, taking her hands in his with an urgency that stole the breath from her chest. I have spent 4 years believing I had nothing left worth fighting for beyond my duty to Lucy, he said, his voice low and fierce. You have shown me that is not true, and I refuse to let fear of Lady Margaret's cruelty convince me to abandon that discovery before I have even had the courage to properly claim it. Do not ask me to let you go, Cassandra. I do not think I have it in me to do it a second time. Cassandra searched his face, finding nothing there but raw, unguarded honesty, and felt her own carefully maintained resolve begin to crack under the weight of it. She wanted, more than she had wanted almost anything, to believe that this could end differently than every previous chapter of her life had taught her to expect. But the fear remained, stubborn and persistent, that her presence in his life would only draw more danger toward the people she had come to love, Lucy most of all. I need time to think, she said finally, gently withdrawing her hands from his. Please, Adrian, give me that much. He agreed, reluctantly, though the worry in his eyes did not fade as he took his leave that evening, and Cassandra spent the following days locked in a private war between her heart's stubborn hope and her mind's careful, hard-won caution, uncertain which would ultimately win the battle for her future. She confided in Aunt Beatrice that same night, laying out the whole tangled situation while her aunt listened with uncharacteristic quiet, her sharp eyes fixed on the fire rather than on Cassandra's face. "You are considering leaving him," her aunt said finally. It was not a question. "I am considering removing myself from a situation that threatens to cost an innocent child her home and her guardian. There is a difference." "Is there?" Aunt Beatrice turned to look at her directly now, and there was no gentleness in her expression, only the same sharp honesty that had first greeted Cassandra on the steps of this house months ago. "Or are you simply frightened, and dressing that fear up as noble sacrifice because it is easier to bear than admitting the truth?" Cassandra opened her mouth to protest, and found she had no ready answer. Her aunt continued before she could recover one. "I watched you find your courage once already, Cassandra, at a dinner table in front of 40 strangers, when you had far less reason to believe anyone would stand beside you afterward. You spoke the truth then because it was right, regardless of what it cost you. Do not let Lady Margaret's cruelty convince you now that love is a debt too dangerous to collect, when you were brave enough to defend a servant girl you had never even properly met. This is different. Lucy's future is at stake, not simply my own comfort. Lucy's future is at stake because Lady Margaret has chosen cruelty as her weapon, not because you dared to care for a good man. If you leave now, you hand that woman exactly the victory she wants, and you teach that child, whom you claim to love, that the people who care for us should abandon the fight the moment it grows difficult. Is that truly the lesson you wish to leave behind?" Cassandra had no answer for that either, and she retreated to her small bedroom that night with her aunt's words circling relentlessly through her thoughts, refusing to settle into any comfortable shape. She did not sleep. Instead, she sat by her window, watching frost creep slowly across the glass, turning over every possible outcome, every version of a future that ended either in Lucy's security or in her own happiness, unable to find any path that seemed to promise both. By morning, exhausted and no closer to certainty, she had nearly convinced herself that leaving remained the only responsible choice. She began, with trembling hands, to compose a letter to Adrian explaining her decision, though the words came slowly and unwillingly, each sentence feeling more like a betrayal of her own heart than the previous one. She had barely finished the second page when a commotion downstairs drew her from her room. Lucy stood in the front hallway, still wrapped in her traveling cloak, having apparently ridden to Thornfield Hollow entirely unescorted, and considerably faster than any 11-year-old ought to manage on a frost-slicked road. "You cannot leave," the girl announced, before anyone had a chance to ask what had brought her there in such a state. Her cheeks were red from cold and exertion, and there were tears standing in her eyes that she clearly refused to let fall. "I heard Uncle Adrian talking to his solicitor last night. He thinks you mean to go away, to protect me from Lady Margaret's scheming. I do not want protecting if it means losing you." "Lucy," Cassandra began, but the girl was not finished. "My father died protecting people he loved. Uncle Adrian told me that once, when I asked why he never came home. He said the bravest thing a person can do is stay, even when staying is frightening, because leaving does not actually make anyone safer, it only makes everyone lonelier." Lucy's voice broke slightly on the final words, and Cassandra felt her own careful resolve crumbling entirely beneath the weight of a child's fierce, uncomplicated honesty. "Please do not leave because of me. I would rather fight Lady Margaret with you here than win without you." Cassandra knelt and pulled the girl into an embrace, her own eyes stinging now, and found in that small, fierce hug something her aunt's careful arguments had not quite managed to provide, a clarity that settled deep and certain in her chest. Leaving would not protect Lucy. It would only prove to Lady Margaret that her cruelty still held the power to scatter every good thing that dared to grow in its path. "I am not going anywhere," she said quietly, and found she meant it completely, for the first time since Adrian's solicitor's letter had arrived. "But we are going to need a plan, Lucy, and a very good one at that." The unfinished letter to Adrian went into the fire that same afternoon. The plan, when it finally took shape over several days of careful discussion between Cassandra, Adrian, and a reluctantly included Aunt Beatrice, hinged on a single crucial weakness in Lady Margaret's scheme. Her allies were bound to her by ambition rather than loyalty, and ambition, properly threatened, tended to abandon its master the moment the cost outweighed the reward. "Edmund Sorrel wants influence and fortune," Adrian said, pacing the length of Aunt Beatrice's parlor while Cassandra watched from her chair near the fire. "He does not particularly care whether that fortune arrives through Louisa or through some arrangement with the Fairfax inheritance. If we can demonstrate that his alliance with Lady Margaret will cost him more than it gains him, he will abandon her scheme the moment it becomes convenient to do so." "And how precisely do we demonstrate that?" Aunt Beatrice asked, arms crossed, clearly unconvinced by the vagueness of the strategy so far. By making certain the Fairfax relations understand exactly what kind of woman is advising them, Cassandra said slowly, an idea beginning to take shape in her mind. Lady Margaret has built her influence on fear and careful management of information. If that information were to include the truth about her own conduct, rather than the version she has so carefully constructed, her allies might find her considerably less useful to their purposes. You mean to expose her, Adrian said. I mean to tell the truth about her, precisely as I did at Rothmere Manor, except this time I intend to make certain it reaches exactly the people who need to hear it, before her version of events can travel first. It was a plan built on considerable risk, and all three of them understood it might fail entirely, might even worsen Cassandra's already damaged reputation if handled poorly. But Cassandra found, turning the possibility over in her mind, that she was tired of running from consequences, tired of shrinking herself smaller in the hope of avoiding further damage. She had spent months believing her honesty at that dinner table had been a mistake to atone for. She was no longer certain that was true. They moved quickly once the decision was made. Adrian wrote personally to the Fairfax relations who had been approached about Lucy's guardianship, laying out plainly and without exaggeration the full history of his care for the girl, the promise he had made her father, and the considerable evidence of Lady Margaret's history of manipulating scandal for her own advantage against anyone who crossed her, servant and nobility alike. Cassandra, meanwhile, wrote to several former acquaintances still in London society, women who had witnessed Lady Margaret's cruelty toward the young housemaid firsthand, but had said nothing at the time out of fear, asking now whether they might finally be willing to confirm what they had seen. The response, when it came, exceeded even Cassandra's cautious hope. 3 separate guests from that fateful dinner at Rothmere Manor, emboldened perhaps by the passage of time or simply weary of watching Lady Margaret's cruelty go unanswered for so long, wrote letters confirming that Cassandra's account of the evening had been entirely accurate, and that the wilder versions circulating through London society bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. One letter came from Lord Rothmere's own wife, who admitted with evident shame that she had allowed fear of Lady Margaret's influence to keep her silent for far too long. Armed with this evidence, Adrian arranged a dinner of his own, a smaller, more careful gathering than the disaster at Rothmere Manor, inviting the Fairfax relations who had been so easily persuaded to question his guardianship, along with several respected figures in London society, whose good opinion Lady Margaret had always been careful to court. Cassandra would attend as well, a decision that worried Aunt Beatrice considerably. You are walking directly back into the lion's den, her aunt warned the night before they were set to travel to London. If this fails, Cassandra, you will have handed Lady Margaret every weapon she needs to finish what she started at Rothmere Manor. If I hide from this instead, I hand her the exact same weapon regardless, Cassandra replied, folding a traveling dress into her trunk with hands that trembled only slightly. I would rather lose while standing my ground than lose while running from it. At least then the loss would be honestly earned. Before they departed for London, Cassandra insisted on one further stop, a visit to her father's house to see Louisa in person, rather than trusting such delicate matters entirely to letters. Her sister met her at the door with tears already standing in her eyes, and the two embraced for a long moment in the front hallway while their father watched from the parlor doorway with an expression Cassandra could not entirely read. You look well, Louisa said finally, pulling back to study her sister's face. Happier than your letters ever let on. I am happier, Cassandra admitted, though I fear I am about to make things considerably more complicated before they grow simpler again. She explained the plan carefully, watching Louisa's expression shift from worry to cautious hope as the details unfolded, and was relieved when her sister offered her support without hesitation, despite the risk it carried for her own reputation should the confrontation fail. Edmund has been distant these past weeks regardless, Louisa admitted quietly. I confess, I have wondered whether his attentions were ever entirely sincere. If exposing Lady Margaret's scheme costs me his interest entirely, I find I am not so troubled by the prospect as I once might have been. Their father, when Cassandra found a private moment to speak with him, offered something she had not expected, a quiet, halting apology for the fear that had driven him to send her away in the first place. I told myself I was protecting this family, he said, unable quite to meet her eyes. I have come to understand, in the months since, that I was protecting my own comfort instead, and calling it wisdom because the truth was too difficult to face. I am sorry, Cassandra. I should have stood beside you that evening, rather than sending you away from it. You believed you had no choice, Cassandra said gently, surprised to find she meant the forgiveness in her words, rather than simply offering it out of duty. I understand that fear now better than I did then. I do not think less of you for having felt it, only for having let it decide so much for both of us. He nodded, and though little more was said between them on the matter, something in the careful distance that had grown between father and daughter over the preceding months began, finally, to ease. The journey to London felt entirely different from the one that had carried her away in disgrace months earlier. Where before she had huddled against the carriage window avoiding the gaze of strangers, now she sat beside Adrian with her spine straight and her resolve steady, Lucy chattering excitedly between them about the adventure of returning to the city she had barely known, before coming to live with her guardian in the countryside. Lady Margaret, predictably, arrived at Adrian's London dinner uninvited, drawn by rumors that something significant was unfolding among the guests she considered her rightful territory to control. She swept into the drawing room with all her usual composed authority, clearly expecting to find Cassandra cowering under the weight of renewed scandal, and her expression flickered with something like surprise when she found the young woman instead seated calmly beside the Duke of Ashworth, meeting her gaze without flinching. "Miss Wren," Lady Margaret said, her voice carrying the same cold precision it had held that terrible evening at Rothmere Manor. "I confess I did not expect to see you showing your face in London society again, given the circumstances of your departure." "The circumstances of my departure were rather different from what you have told everyone, my lady," Cassandra replied, keeping her voice level despite the racing of her heart. "I defended a servant girl you had humiliated for your own amusement. That was the entirety of my crime, though I understand you have constructed a considerably more dramatic version in the months since." A ripple of uncomfortable murmuring moved through the assembled guests, and Lady Margaret's composure flickered, just barely, before she recovered it. "You would accuse me of dishonesty, in front of witnesses, based on nothing more than your own word?" "Not based on my word alone." Adrian rose from his seat, and there was a quiet authority in his voice that commanded the room's attention entirely. "I have here letters from 3 guests present at that dinner, along with a written statement from Lady Rothmere herself, all confirming that Miss Wren's account of that evening was accurate, and that the version you have since spread through London society bears little resemblance to what actually occurred. I have also gathered testimony regarding your treatment of household staff over the years, evidence that suggests this was not an isolated incident, but rather a pattern you have relied upon your influence to keep hidden." The room fell into stunned silence. Lady Margaret's face had gone pale beneath her careful powder, though her eyes remained hard and calculating, searching for some escape from the trap closing around her. "This is nothing more than a coordinated attack against a woman whose only crime was speaking honestly about a scandal that damaged this family's reputation," she said, though her voice had lost some of its usual commanding certainty. "The only reputation damaged that evening was the one you constructed for yourself, through cruelty toward people with no power to defend themselves," Cassandra said. "I have spent months paying for a single honest sentence spoken in defense of a girl who could not defend herself. I do not intend to pay for it any longer, my lady. And I do not intend to let you damage this family." She gestured toward Adrian and, gently, toward Lucy seated nearby, watching the confrontation with wide, fascinated eyes. "The way you damaged mine." It was Edmund Sorrel, watching from near the doorway, who made the decision that ultimately shattered Lady Margaret's remaining influence over the room. Seeing clearly now that her scheme had collapsed under the weight of gathered evidence, and calculating swiftly that his own reputation stood to suffer considerably by continued association with her, he stepped forward with the practiced ease of a man abandoning a sinking ship before it could drag him under with it. "I feel I must be honest as well," he said, addressing the room at large while carefully avoiding Lady Margaret's furious glare. "I was approached by Lady Margaret some weeks ago and asked to gather information that might be used against Miss Wren and the Duke of Ashworth, with the promise of certain benefits should the scheme succeed regarding Miss Fairfax's inheritance. I regret my participation in it, and I offer my sincerest apology to Miss Louisa Wren, whose good opinion I valued a great deal more than I allowed my recent conduct to demonstrate." The confession, delivered with such calculated timing, sealed Lady Margaret's defeat entirely. The Fairfax relations who had been so easily persuaded to question Adrian's guardianship now exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly reconsidering the wisdom of having aligned themselves with a woman whose manipulation had just been exposed so thoroughly and publicly. One by one they approached Adrian with quiet, embarrassed apologies, assuring him that no further action would be taken regarding Lucy's guardianship. Lady Margaret remained a moment longer, her composure entirely abandoned now, her eyes moving across the room, and finding nothing but cold judgment and quiet satisfaction in the faces watching her. Whatever she had intended to say seemed to die in her throat, and she turned instead and swept from the room without another word, her carefully constructed authority collapsing behind her like a house built on sand finally meeting the tide. Cassandra released a breath she had not realized she was holding, and felt Adrian's hand find hers, steady and certain, beneath the cover of the table. "You were magnificent," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear it. "We were magnificent," she corrected softly, and found she meant it entirely. It had taken every one of them, Adrian's careful evidence, Lucy's fierce loyalty, Aunt Beatrice's sharp honesty, and her own long-delayed willingness to stand her ground rather than run from it, to finally dismantle a cruelty that had gone unanswered for far too long. Across the room, Lucy caught Cassandra's eye and grinned, entirely unbothered by the drama that had just unfolded around her, already looking as though she considered the whole evening a marvelous adventure worth retelling to anyone who would listen. Cassandra found herself laughing softly, despite the exhaustion settling into her bones, and for the first time since that terrible dinner at Rothmere Manor so many months ago, she allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that her honesty had finally found its reward rather than its punishment. The days that followed the confrontation brought a flood of changes Cassandra could scarcely have imagined only weeks earlier. Invitations she had assumed lost forever began arriving once more at her father's house, though she found herself considerably more selective about which she chose to accept, unwilling to return fully to a society that had so readily believed the worst of her without question. Louisa, freed from Edmund Sorel's fickle attentions entirely once his role in Lady Margaret's scheme became widely known, found herself unexpectedly courted by a quieter, steadier gentleman who had apparently admired her from a respectful distance for some time, too shy to compete with Edmund's louder charm until circumstances cleared the way. Lady Margaret herself largely vanished from London's social calendar in the weeks that followed, her invitations quietly declined by hosts no longer eager to associate with a woman whose cruelty had been so thoroughly exposed. Cassandra felt, when she allowed herself to consider the woman's fate at all, less triumph than a kind of tired relief, the particular exhaustion of a long battle finally, truly over. Through it all, Adrian remained a steady, constant presence at her side, and Cassandra found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely unafraid of what the future might hold. Late one evening, some days after the dinner that had unraveled Lady Margaret's schemes entirely, Adrian found Cassandra alone on the small terrace behind her father's house, watching the last of the evening light fade over the city rooftops. He joined her without a word at first, simply standing beside her at the railing, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cooling air. "I keep thinking of that night in the library at Rothmere Manor," he said finally, "when I told you that what you had done took courage, and you looked at me as though you could not decide whether to believe it. I have wondered since whether you ever fully came to trust that I meant it." "I trust it now," Cassandra said, and found the words entirely true as she spoke them, though I confess it took considerably longer than it should have. I had grown so used to expecting punishment for honesty that I did not quite know what to do when someone offered admiration instead. "You do not have to wonder any longer." He turned to face her fully, his expression unusually open in the fading light, none of his usual careful reserve remaining. "I meant every word that night, and every word since. I have watched you fight for Lucy, for your sister, for the truth itself, at considerable cost to your own comfort every single time, and I find myself more certain with each passing day that I do not wish to spend whatever years remain to me without you beside me for the rest of them." Cassandra's heart raced, though she said nothing yet, sensing there was more he wished to say, and not wanting to interrupt whatever courage he had gathered to say it. "I am not going to ask you tonight," he continued, a small rueful smile touching his mouth. "You deserve better than a quiet terrace, and a moment stolen between the chaos of the past weeks. But I wanted you to know plainly what I intend, so that when the moment comes, it will not surprise you, only, I hope, please you." "I think," Cassandra said softly, feeling something warm and certain settle deep in her chest, "that very little you could do at this point would surprise me any more, Adrian. But I do not think it would displease me either." He laughed then, a real, unguarded sound she had come to treasure more than almost anything else about him, and reached for her hand, holding it gently as the last light faded entirely from the sky above them. The invitation arrived a fortnight later, addressed to Cassandra in handwriting she did not recognize, sealed with the crest of a family she had met only briefly during the difficult weeks following Lady Margaret's exposure. The Countess of Ellery was hosting a ball, the largest of the season, and though Cassandra had grown considerably more selective about which invitations she accepted since her return to London society, this one carried a note in Adrian's own hand tucked inside, asking her plainly to attend, and to wear the deep blue gown she had worn the evening they first properly discussed his hopes for the future. She should have suspected something from the request alone. She did not, too absorbed in the ordinary business of choosing ribbons and gloves to consider that Adrian rarely asked for anything so specific without careful purpose behind it. The ballroom, when she arrived on her father's arm with Louisa close behind, glittered with more candles than Cassandra had ever seen gathered in a single room, chandeliers blazing overhead and casting warm golden light across gowns and jewels and the polished floor where couples had already begun to gather for the evening's first dances. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of grand, glittering occasion that had once made her feel smallest and most uncertain of her place, the kind of room where a single misplaced word could unravel a reputation entirely. She felt none of that uncertainty now. She had learned, over the difficult months since Rothmere Manor, that her place in such rooms did not depend on anyone else's approval, only on her own willingness to stand steadily within it. Adrian found her within moments of her arrival, looking, she thought, more nervous than she had ever seen him, his usual careful composure fraying slightly at the edges, despite his obvious effort to maintain it. "You look beautiful," he said, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to it that lingered a moment longer than strict propriety allowed. "Thank you for wearing the blue. You were rather specific in your request. I confess I have been wondering all evening what prompted it. You will understand soon enough," he said, and something in his tone, warm and a little unsteady, sent a flutter of anticipation through her chest that she could not quite name. They danced twice that evening, and Cassandra found herself laughing more freely than she had in any London ballroom in longer than she could remember, the old anxious watchfulness that had once governed every moment in such rooms entirely absent from her enjoyment of the evening. Lucy, who had been permitted to attend for the early portion of the ball as a special treat, watched from near the refreshment table with an expression of barely contained excitement that Cassandra noticed but could not quite decipher, exchanging frequent, meaningful glances with Aunt Beatrice, who had traveled to London specifically for the occasion, and now stood beside the girl with a knowing smile she made little effort to hide. Midway through the evening, as Cassandra stood near the edge of the floor catching her breath after the second dance, a familiar figure approached that made her stomach tighten with old, half-forgotten unease. Lady Rothmere, the very woman whose supper table had witnessed the beginning of Cassandra's downfall so many months earlier, stood before her now with an expression of careful humility that seemed genuine rather than merely polite. "Miss Wren," she said, then corrected herself with a small, rueful smile. "I understand congratulations may soon be in order, given the way the Duke has been watching you all evening. You are very perceptive, my lady. I owe you an apology I should have offered long before now." Lady Rothmere's gaze dropped briefly before returning to meet Cassandra's directly. "I sat at that table and said nothing while Lady Margaret twisted the story of that evening into something cruel and false, though I knew the truth of what had happened as well as anyone in the room. I told myself my silence was simple prudence. I have come to understand, since, that it was cowardice wearing prudence as a disguise, and I am ashamed of how long it took me to admit as much, even to myself." Cassandra considered her for a long moment, remembering the woman's dropped napkin that terrible evening, the flicker of discomfort she had shown even then. "I appreciate the honesty, my lady, though I confess I would have appreciated it rather more had it arrived somewhat sooner. You would be entirely justified in holding that against me. I find I no longer have much interest in holding grudges against everyone who once chose silence over courage," Cassandra said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. "It is a great deal of weight to carry, and I have carried enough of it already this past year. I would rather simply be glad that you have found the courage now, however late it arrived." Lady Rothmere's eyes glistened, and she pressed Cassandra's hand briefly, before retreating back into the crowd, leaving Cassandra with a curious, settled feeling of closure she had not expected to find that evening, layered quietly beneath the growing anticipation of whatever Adrian still seemed to be building toward. It was during a brief pause between dances, as the orchestra prepared for the next set and the room buzzed with conversation and laughter, that Adrian led Cassandra toward the center of the floor rather than back toward the edges where they had been standing. And something in his manner shifted entirely, the last of his nervous energy settling suddenly into a quiet, deliberate calm. "Your Grace," Cassandra said, glancing around at the guests who had begun to notice their unusual position at the center of the room. "What precisely are you doing?" "Something I have wanted to do for a considerable time," he said, and something I have decided I am no longer willing to do quietly, in a library after midnight, or on a terrace where no one else can witness it." The orchestra fell silent at some unseen signal, and the room's attention, already partially drawn by their position at the floor's center, turned fully toward them now, conversation dying into curious, expectant quiet. Cassandra felt her heart begin to race, understanding suddenly and all at once exactly what was unfolding around her, and found herself entirely unable to speak, unable even to fully breathe, as Adrian lowered himself to one knee before the assembled guests of London's most fashionable ball. "Nearly a year ago," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "I watched a young woman stand up in the middle of a crowded dinner and defend a servant girl no one else in that room had the courage to defend. She was punished for it, cruelly and unfairly, by people who valued their own comfort more than they valued the truth. I told her that night that what she had done took extraordinary courage, and I have watched her prove that courage again and again in every month since, defending her sister's happiness, defending my ward's future, defending the truth itself against a woman who had spent decades using cruelty as a weapon against anyone too powerless to fight back." A murmur moved through the room, guests exchanging glances, some already beginning to understand what was unfolding before them, though none dared interrupt the moment with anything more than whispered speculation. "I do not wish to hide this any longer," Adrian continued, "or to offer my regard for her only in private moments where society's judgment cannot reach us. Cassandra Wren, you were banished from this very society for the crime of speaking honestly, when silence would have been so much easier and so much safer. I am asking you now, in front of every person who once believed the worst of you without question, to give me the honor of your name, so that the whole of London might witness exactly what kind of woman they so nearly lost through their own cowardice." He drew a small velvet box from his coat, opening it to reveal a ring set with a single deep sapphire that caught the candlelight, and seemed, for a moment, to hold the whole glittering room within its depths. "Cassandra, will you marry me?" The silence that followed felt to Cassandra like it stretched across an eternity, though in truth it could only have lasted a handful of heartbeats. She looked around the room at the faces watching her, some of them the very same faces that had turned away from her in disgust and disapproval only months earlier, now waiting with breathless anticipation for her answer, and felt none of the old fear that such scrutiny had once inspired in her. She felt instead something steady and certain and entirely her own. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, carrying easily through the silent room. "Yes, I will marry you." The ballroom erupted into applause and delighted exclamation as Adrian rose and slid the ring onto her trembling hand, before pulling her into an embrace that entirely disregarded whatever remained of proper ballroom decorum, and Cassandra laughed through sudden tears, overwhelmed by joy and by the strange, wonderful symmetry of finding vindication in the very room type where she had once feared she would never again be welcome. Lucy came racing across the floor the moment propriety allowed, throwing her arms around both of them at once with such enthusiasm that she nearly knocked all three of them off balance, and Aunt Beatrice followed at a more dignified pace, though the satisfaction in her eyes was unmistakable. Louisa embraced her sister next, whispering something about having always known this day would come, and even their father approached with tears standing openly in his eyes, offering an apology and a blessing in the same trembling breath. Across the room, Cassandra noticed several of the very guests who had once whispered so cruelly about her disgrace, now approaching with careful, apologetic smiles, eager suddenly to reclaim whatever connection they could to a story that had turned so unexpectedly in her favor. She accepted their congratulations with polite grace, though she noted, with quiet private satisfaction, precisely how quickly society's judgment could reverse itself once the wind shifted direction, and resolved to remember the lesson well. In the weeks between the proposal and the wedding, Cassandra found herself returning often to Rothmere Manor in her thoughts, though she never spoke aloud of visiting the place where everything had begun. It was Adrian who finally suggested it, quietly, one evening as they sat together going over wedding plans with Aunt Beatrice. "I think you should see that dining room again," he said, not as the girl who was banished from it, but as the woman who was about to become a duchess. "I think it might close something in you that has never quite finished closing." Lord Rothmere, when they rode ahead to ask, welcomed them with evident relief, eager himself to put the memory of that painful evening behind him. Cassandra stood once more in the very room where she had risen to her feet and told a countess the truth, and found the space smaller and less frightening than memory had made it. The candlelight ordinary now rather than menacing, the long table simply a table rather than a stage for judgment. She stood where she had stood that night, Adrian's hand steady in hers, and felt the last of the old fear finally loosen its grip on her chest entirely. "I am glad I said it," she told him quietly, looking around the transformed room. "Whatever it cost me, I would say it again exactly the same way, knowing everything that followed. I would not wish it any other way," he said. "That single sentence is the reason I ever came to know you at all." The wedding took place 2 months later, a considerably smaller and warmer affair than the grand ball where Adrian had proposed, held in the chapel near Ashworth House with only close family and friends in attendance, exactly as Cassandra had requested. Lucy served as an enthusiastic and entirely unconventional flower girl, scattering petals with far more energy than grace, while Aunt Beatrice watched from the front pew with tears she did not bother to hide. Louisa stood as her sister's attendant, radiant with her own quiet happiness, her steady new suitor watching proudly from among the guests. Cassandra spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice that carried easily through the small chapel, the same voice that had once shaken a dinner table full of frightened strangers into silence, and found in the speaking of them a satisfaction deeper than any vindication London's ballrooms could have offered her. She had been banished for refusing to stay silent in the face of cruelty. She had returned, in the end, not by shrinking herself smaller to fit the shape society demanded of her, but by standing exactly as tall and as honest as she had always been, and finding, at last, a family who loved her precisely for it. As they left the chapel together as husband and wife, Adrian leaned close and murmured something meant only for her. "I believe," he said, "that Lady Margaret Vale has never once in her life been so thoroughly and publicly proven wrong about anything as she was about you." Cassandra laughed, bright and unguarded, and turned her face toward the winter sunlight breaking through the clouds overhead, no longer the disgraced young woman who had fled London in shame, but a duchess who had earned her place through honesty rather than silence, standing beside a man who had loved her precisely for the courage that once nearly cost her everything. They traveled to Ashworth's coastal estate for a quiet few weeks following the wedding, away from London's watchful eyes entirely, and Cassandra found in those simple, unhurried days a happiness so complete it sometimes startled her, waking each morning beside a man who had chosen her openly, in front of the very society that had once tried so hard to cast her out. Lucy joined them for part of the visit, delighted to have Cassandra permanently installed as something closer to family than guest, and spent long afternoons teaching Cassandra the names of every seabird along the shore with the same fierce enthusiasm she brought to everything else. Word reached them eventually that Lady Margaret had retired entirely from London society, removing herself to a distant country property where her diminished influence could do considerably less damage, and Cassandra found she felt no particular satisfaction in the news beyond a quiet, settled relief that the chapter was finally, truly closed. Louisa's letters arrived regularly, filled with growing affection for her steady new suitor, and Cassandra allowed herself to hope that her sister's happiness, too, might finally be permitted to unfold without the shadow of scandal trailing behind it. Looking back, in the years that followed, Cassandra would often think of that single honest sentence spoken at a crowded dinner table, the sentence that had cost her so much and, in the end, given her so much more than she could ever have imagined possible on the night she spoke it. She had learned, through banishment and storm and quiet country afternoons, through fierce childish loyalty and a duke's steady, patient devotion, that honesty was rarely without cost, but that the cost of silence, carried long enough, was always steeper still. She had chosen in the end, exactly as she had chosen that first terrible evening at Rothmere Manor, to speak plainly and stand her ground, and had found waiting for her on the other side of that choice not ruin, but a family, a home, and a love built on nothing less than the whole honest truth of who she was. 3 years after the wedding, a letter arrived at Ashworth House that made Cassandra set down her tea with hands that trembled slightly, though not from fear this time. It came from a young woman named Grace Milbrook, a housemaid in service to a family in Surrey, someone Cassandra had never met and could not immediately place. She read the letter twice before its meaning fully settled into her chest, and then called for Adrian with an urgency that brought him hurrying from his study, certain from her tone that something had gone wrong. Nothing had gone wrong, quite the opposite. Grace wrote that she had heard the story, now told and retold so many times through servants' quarters and village gossip alike, that it had taken on the shape of legend, of a young lady who had once stood up at a grand dinner and defended a housemaid against a cruel and powerful woman, at tremendous cost to her own reputation. Grace explained, in careful, uncertain handwriting, that she had recently found herself in a similar position, humiliated by her own mistress in front of guests for a trivial mistake, and had found the courage to speak up in her own defense for the first time in her life, remembering the story of the lady who had once done the same for a stranger. It had cost Grace her position. She had been dismissed within the week, exactly as Cassandra might have predicted from her own painful experience. But she wrote not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet pride Cassandra recognized immediately, the particular steadiness of someone who had chosen honesty knowing full well what it might cost, and found the choice worth making regardless. She has nowhere to go, Cassandra said, looking up at Adrian with an idea already forming, one she suspected he would guess before she finished voicing it. No family to return to, no references from a mistress she embarrassed by refusing to stay silent. You want to offer her a position here. I want to offer her considerably more than a position if you are willing. Cassandra folded the letter carefully, some old, familiar fire kindling in her chest, the same fire that had once carried her to her feet at a crowded dinner table years earlier. I want to help her find her footing properly, Adrian. Employment, certainly, but also the kind of support that might have made a difference to me, had I not had a stubborn aunt and a patient duke willing to stand beside me while London decided what to make of my scandal. Adrian did not hesitate. Write to her today. Tell her Ashworth House has a place for her, for as long as she wishes it, and tell her that whatever she needs beyond employment, she need only ask. Before Grace's arrival, Aunt Beatrice, visiting for the season, offered Cassandra a piece of practical advice that stayed with her long afterward. You will want to be careful not to smother the girl with your own history, her aunt said, settling into her usual chair by the fire with the particular bluntness age had only sharpened rather than softened. It is a natural temptation, seeing your own story reflected in someone else's misfortune, to want to shape their recovery into the same pattern your own took. But Grace is not you, Cassandra, whatever similarities her letter suggests. Let her find her own footing in her own way, and simply be there to catch her if she stumbles. Cassandra took the advice seriously, and made a point, once Grace arrived, of asking a great many questions and offering very few instructions, allowing the young woman space to settle into Ashworth House on her own terms, rather than according to some plan Cassandra might have designed for her in advance. Grace arrived a fortnight later, thin and nervous and clearly braced for disappointment, and found instead a household that welcomed her without judgment or condition. Lucy, now 14 and every bit as fierce and outspoken as she had promised to become, took an immediate liking to the young woman, delighted to find someone new who shared her particular impatience with unfairness, dressed up as propriety. Aunt Beatrice, visiting for the summer as she often did now, declared within a week that Grace possessed more good sense than half the peerage combined, a judgment she did not trouble herself to deliver quietly. Over the following months, Cassandra found herself thinking often about Grace's letter, and about how many other young women, servants and gentlewomen alike, might be carrying similar stories of silenced courage, moments when speaking honestly had cost them dearly and left them with nowhere to turn afterward. The thought settled into her mind and would not leave, growing steadily into something more deliberate than a passing sympathy. I want to do something more permanent, she told Adrian one evening, the two of them seated by the fire in the same sitting room where he had first told her, years earlier, that her honesty at Rothmere Manor had taken extraordinary courage. Not simply helping one young woman when her letter happens to find its way to me, but building something steadier, a house perhaps, somewhere near London, for women dismissed from service for standing up against cruelty, somewhere they might find shelter and training for new positions while they find their footing again. Adrian considered the proposal with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to every decision, though she could see the idea taking root in him almost as quickly as it had in her. It would draw attention, he said, some of it unkind. There will be those who call it an encouragement toward insolence among servants, who say you are teaching young women to defy their betters. Let them say it. Cassandra had grown considerably less concerned over the years with the opinions of people determined to misunderstand her regardless of what she did. I would rather be accused of encouraging courage than spend my life quietly permitting cruelty to continue unanswered, because I feared what critics might say about it. He smiled then, the same warm, unguarded smile she had come to treasure above almost anything else in her life, and reached for her hand across the space between their chairs. Then we shall build it together. I imagine Lucy will want a say in the matter as well, and I suspect Aunt Beatrice will have several very firm opinions about how it ought to be run. They did build it over the following year, a modest house not far from London that came to be known simply as Wren House, named at Adrian's insistence rather than Cassandra's own preference, offering shelter, honest wages, and proper references to young women who had lost their positions for refusing to stay silent in the face of cruelty. Grace became its first steward, proving herself remarkably capable at managing both the practical business of the house and the delicate work of helping frightened, uncertain young women rebuild their confidence after dismissal and disgrace. The house drew exactly the criticism Adrian had predicted, whispered disapproval from certain corners of society who found the whole enterprise faintly scandalous, and encouragement towards servants forgetting their proper place. Cassandra found she minded these criticisms considerably less than she once might have. She had learned, through banishment and storm and a public proposal in a candlelit ballroom, that the opinions of people determined to misunderstand courage were rarely worth the anxiety spent anticipating them. More gratifying by far were the letters that arrived steadily in the years that followed, from young women who had found their way to Wren House in moments of desperation and left it with steady employment, restored confidence, and a story of their own to eventually pass along to someone else in need of the same courage. Cassandra kept every one of them in a small wooden box on her writing desk, and on difficult days, when old doubts occasionally resurfaced despite everything she had built since that terrible evening at Rothmere Manor, she would take them out and read through a handful, reminding herself precisely what her single honest sentence, spoken so long ago at a crowded dinner table, had ultimately grown into. Lucy, now nearly grown and already showing signs of inheriting both her guardian's steady judgment and Cassandra's fierce refusal to stay quietly silent in the face of unfairness, spent increasing amounts of time at Wren House herself, learning its workings with the clear intention of one day taking a more permanent hand in its management. She had grown, in the years since that first frightened winter, into precisely the kind of young woman Cassandra had once hoped she might become, unafraid to speak plainly, unwilling to shrink herself for anyone's comfort, and fiercely protective of anyone she considered under her care. On the evening of Wren House's 3rd anniversary, Cassandra stood in its modest front hall watching Grace direct a small celebration for the current residents, watching Lucy laugh with 2 young women only a few years older than herself, watching Adrian move easily among guests who had once been strangers to him and were now, in some quiet way, extended family. She thought, as she often did on such evenings, of the frightened, humiliated young woman who had once fled London believing her honesty had ruined everything worth having in her life. That young woman, Cassandra thought, watching the warm scene unfold before her, could never have imagined how thoroughly her single moment of courage would eventually multiply itself, spreading outward through every life it touched, gathering strength rather than losing it with each retelling. She had been banished for speaking her mind. She had returned, in the fullness of time, to build a home where speaking honestly was no longer something to survive, but something to be celebrated, protected, and passed forward to every young woman brave enough to choose truth over comfortable silence. Adrian found her there at the edge of the celebration, slipping his hand into hers with the same quiet certainty he had shown every day since that stormy night so many years before. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, watching the same warm scene she had been studying. "Not one," Cassandra said, and meant it entirely, watching the candlelight of Wren House glow warm against the gathering evening, exactly as it had once glowed in a library at Rothmere Manor, on the night her whole life had quietly, irrevocably begun to change for the better.